Flexbox is one of the most powerful tools you could be using when writing CSS, so it's very important to understand how Flexbox works and when you should be using Flexbox. So in this video, we're going to go over everything you need to know about Flexbox. So Flexbox is a very powerful layout tool that allows you to lay out different elements inside of a parent Flexbox container. And these Flexbox containers give you massive control over exactly where you position these elements at. So that's enough of me talking. Let's define our first Flexbox container. So we've got a parent that's got 3 containing childs in it right now, or children in it right now. So let's define our Flexbox, our display flex on our parent container. So let's just select the parent, and we're going to define our display of flex. And as soon as I save, you're going to see a major change, and everything is going to basically go inline. And the reason for that is because everything is going to follow the flex axis. So everything is going to go side by side. And the reason for that is because Flexbox aligns things based on 2 different axes. You've got the main axis, which for now we're just going to assume that's going to be the horizontal axis. And then we've got the cross axis, which for now we're also going to assume that's going to be the vertical axis. And based on these 2 axes, Flexbox is going to align your items along both of them to give you the layout that you're desiring. So to align elements based on your main axis, you're going to use the property justify content. And this here, you have quite a few different options that you can choose from. This is going to align all of the elements along the main axis. So if you just wanted to center everything, you could just type in center, and if we save, you can see all 3 of the elements are now centered along this horizontal axis. Starting from the center, it's just centering the whole thing. And there are also a lot of other justify content options that we can choose from. So if we wanted to align everything to the end of the box, we could define the flex end property, and that's going to align everything based on the very end of the box. It's still going to keep everything in the same order, but it's going to align everything to the end of the box. And if we want to align it to the beginning again, all we'd have to do is do flex start, and that's going to align everything to the very beginning of the flex box. We also have quite a few other options, and these other options are the ones that are really going to make Flexbox stand out. So we have these space options, and we have a space around, a space between, and we have a space evenly. So let's start off with the space evenly. Now the space evenly option is going to space all of these items inside of here evenly. So you're going to have an even amount of space at the beginning, an even amount of space in between every item, and an even amount of space at the end. So there's an even amount of space in between everything. Now the space between option is going to space all of the extra space in between the different elements. So you have an even amount of space here and an even amount of space here, and the first one and the last one are flush against the beginning and the end. And then you have the space around option, and this is just going to give an even amount of space around each box. So you're going to have half of the amount of space at the beginning, and then 1 full amount of space in between each, and half at the end. So this is just the same as giving a little bit of margin to each one of these elements. It's going to have 1 full amount of space in between each element, and then it's going to have half of that amount of space at the beginning and at the end. And these are all based along the main axis. All of these justify content options are going to be aligned based along the main axis, which for now, again, is just the horizontal axis. Now let's talk about the cross axis, or for now, again, it's the vertical axis. So let's go ahead and comment out the justify content, and if we save, you can see the default is actually, it starts at the beginning. So about the cross axis, we are going to define elements along the cross axis using the align items property. And this works very similar to the justify content, but there's a few differences between them. So the align items property is going to align items along the cross axis. So if we want to center align those along the cross axis, it's going to align those items based on the up and down axis. So it's going to find the center and it's going to align them there, just like that. We can also have the flex start, which is the very beginning, that's our default, and we also have the flex end, which is the very end of the flex box. And these three properties, flex start, center, and flex end, are going to be the three main properties that you're going to be applying to the align items property. And I know what you're thinking, Kylan, what if I want to align them along the vertical axis? What about the space properties? Well, for that I have you covered. We have the flex direction property, and the flex direction property is actually going to change the direction of the main axis. So with flex direction we have two main options. We have row and we have column. So row is going to be the default, and row is going to be what we've been working with so far. The main axis is the horizontal axis and the cross axis is going to be the vertical axis. Well, if we change that to column, then we're going to basically flip the two axes. So now the main axis is going to be the one going up and down, the vertical axis, and the cross axis is going to be the horizontal axis now. As you can see, we've got the align items property set to flex end, and it's aligned based on the cross axis now, which is the horizontal axis. And now with flex direction set to column and both of the axes are flipped, we can actually use the justify content property to use the space properties on the vertical axis. So if we save that, you can see that the space around property is working on the vertical axis now. And we can actually use the evenly, and we can actually use the between space properties as well. And this align items property, we can do a flex start, or we could do a center, and this is going to work along the cross axis, the new cross axis, which is now the horizontal axis. So whenever you have flex direction set to column, the main axis is going to be the vertical axis and the cross axis is going to be the horizontal axis. Now I'm actually going to go ahead and remove all of these and set everything back to its default. So we just have that display flex set on there. Now we're actually going to give this a little bit of a gap, so that way we can space a little bit of extra space in between each one of our flex items. So to do that, we're going to give it the gap property, and we can assign this any kind of pixel or relative value. So we could do a pixel value or a rem and em, whatever. So let's just give it a 15 pixel gap. Now the gap works in between the elements. It's not going to work at the front or the end of the elements. It's just going to give it space in between each one of the elements. And if we had elements below these elements, it would give it 15 pixels on those elements as well. So it works a little bit like margin, but it doesn't give it to each one. It's instead putting a gap of that amount of space in between each one of these elements. So you'll have 15 pixels of space here, and you'll have 15 pixels of space here. Plus I added 5 pixels of margin on each one of these items, so you'll have 5 pixels of margin on each one of those as well. But yes, you have 15 pixels of gap from this to this and from this to this, but nothing at the beginning and nothing at the end. Now believe it or not, the children actually have more power over their spacing than the parent does. So let's go ahead and remove this gap, and we're going to select the child. And I've actually applied the child class to all three of these. So if we affect one, we're going to affect all if we're just selecting the child class. So let's go ahead and actually, we're going to use this middle one here for now. So we're going to use an nth child of 2, and I'm actually going to give this a different background color of orange so we can more clearly see what we're working with. So as I said before, the children actually have more power over the spacing than their parent does. So if I wanted to align this specific middle one here to the end, and just this middle one, I want to keep this first one and this last one the same, but I want to move this middle one to the end, all I'd have to do is say align self and flex end, just like that. And it's going to align just that child, just that second one that we selected, to the end. So it's telling to align itself to the end, but nothing else. Everything else is going to stay within the borders of that flex box that we've set up here on the parent. And we can actually set on that parent as well the justify content, let's just say center, and that third one down here is actually going to follow along with that, but it's still going to follow that self-align flex end, because it is aligned itself to the end of the cross axis, but it's still following along the parent orders as well. And so if we wanted to do the exact same thing with the third one, we could just select the child class and change this to a 3. And let's give this a background color of orange as well. And let's actually align this to the center. So we're going to align self to center, just like that. And you can see that this third one is aligned itself based on the cross axis to the very center, still abiding by that justify content center that was applied to the parent. Now let's actually remove this, and we're going to remove this so that everything is now centered along this axis, and this second one is still that orange color because we're still going to be playing with that one. So we can actually reorder these elements as well, and we can use the order property, and this will allow us to reorder the elements. This is something that you could only do with Flexbox. You can't do it with just about any way else in CSS. So to reorder these, basically, we need to understand how the order works. So the order is applied to the child that you've selected. So right now we've selected this orange one, this second one here. And based on the child, that is the start point of where the order is going to start. So it's kind of weird the way it works, but it makes sense once you understand it. So from the child that we've selected, we're actually going to start with order at 0. So this is at 0. And if we wanted to move it to the left, we are actually going to pass in a negative number. And if we wanted to move it to the right, we're actually going to pass in a positive number. So if I wanted to move this to the end and bring this third one to the middle here, we can actually pass in a 1 here. And that is going to reorder it so that this is now one spot to the right of where it was before. And if we pass it a 0, it's going to order it to 0. This is the starting point for that specific child. And if we wanted to move it to the left, we would pass in a -1, and that's going to move it to the left by 1. Now the next thing we're going to take a look at is actually flex wrap. And flex wrap is a bit confusing at first, but you'll get the hang of it the more you use it. So flex wrap is going to be set on the parent element, and for this I've added 3 more children here so we can more easily see this happen. Flex wrap is going to be applied to the parent element, not the child element, but the parent element. And by default, flex wrap is set to no wrap. That means it's not going to wrap the elements whenever they overflow the Flexbox container. But let's set it to flex wrap of wrap. And this is going to tell it to wrap any elements that are going to overflow the container. So this normally would have overflown the container because each one of these normally are set to 100 pixels wide, and this big container is set to 500. So we've got 600 pixels wide plus some extra, and it's all fitting on one row. But if we save the flex wrap to wrap, you can actually see these bottom 2 have wrapped down here to the bottom. And that's because we set the flex wrap to wrap. And that way it's going to, once it gets to the end and there's not enough space, it's going to wrap down to the next line. And if we add a few more, if we add a few more like this, you can actually see that it's wrapping down to the next one as well. So flex wrap will not wrap it as long as there's enough space to fit all of the content. But as soon as we got to this 5th one here, there wasn't enough space here to fit this 5th one, so it wrapped down to the next line. And we can actually do a reverse wrap, a wrap reverse, And what this is going to do is actually going to wrap up rather than wrapping down to the next line. And we can actually see this more clearly if we add a few more. It's actually wrapping from the bottom to the top. And that's just a reverse wrap. And we can just go ahead and change this back to just a flex wrap. And for the next thing that we're going to take a look at, we actually need this flex wrap to stay on, just to make it a little bit easier. So the next thing that we're going to take a look at is actually going to be applied to the child. So we're actually going to apply it to each one of the children. So we're just going to select the child class, which is applied to each one of those children. And we're going to set the flex basis property. Now this flex basis property is going to set the basis for how wide each one of these flex items are. So we can set this to a 200 pixel wide flex basis, and this is going to be the basis for all of our flex grow and flex shrink elements. So whenever we set the flex basis, this is going to be the base property for how these things should react. So by default, it's going to be 200 pixels. And that's what the flex basis does. It just sets how wide the child elements are going to be at the very beginning. And we can actually set this to just about any size property. So we could say 15% of the parent size, and each one of these is going to be 15% of the parent size. Or we could do a for rem, and we could set it as for rem of the root element. So let's just set it back to 200 pixels just for simplistic sake. Now the next few properties we're going to take a look at are going to be the flex grow and the flex shrink properties. And let's start off with the flex grow property. So the flex grow property is going to tell it to grow the children to fill all of the excess space. So all of this excess space here at the end, it's going to fill that up whenever I set the flex grow property to a 1. And you can see that it's filled up all that extra space at the end. Now you'll notice it hasn't filled up this space in between though. And that's because I've simply just set a margin on these right here of 5 pixels on each side. So there's 10 pixels of space in between each one of these that the flex grow is not going to actually fill up. But everything else, every extra bit of space that's not used in the Flexbox container is actually going to be used up by this flex grow property. And by default, the flex grow is actually set to 0. So this is going to be our default initial value if it were not set. And if we set it to a 1, it's just going to fill up all of the excess space. Now the flex grow property on specific children is actually where it gets a little confusing. So let's take the second and the fourth one, and we're going to set a flex grow on both of those. So let's check out child, nth child of 2, and that's going to select this one right here. And just to see that, we're going to set the background color to orange. And we're going to set a flex grow factor to 1. And now you're going to notice that it's going to take up all the space. And that's because this is the only one that is set to flex grow. Now, if I were to set another one to flex grow, it set that actually to a factor of 2. So we're going to select the fourth one, this one here. We're going to change the background to orange as well, and we're going to actually set that to a flex grow factor of 2. Now you can actually see that the fourth one is bigger than the second one. And the reason for that is that the value of the flex grow is going to be dependent on the other elements that have the flex grow property initialized. So these ones that are red don't have a flex grow property initialized, so they're set to their default flex basis of 50 pixels. Now this flex grow of 1 on the second child, that is saying that a factor of 1 for that child. Now whenever it was just that child with only being the only one that had the flex grow property set, it's going to be a factor of just that one child. So it's going to take up all of the extra space. But as soon as we added the second child that has the flex grow property set to a factor of 2, now this fourth child actually has double the amount of space, or roughly double the amount of space as this second one. So this one, the second one, is half the size of this fourth one, or roughly half the size. And all they're doing is splitting them up based on their factor. So this is getting 2/3 of the excess space, and this is getting 1/3 of the excess space out of all of the excess space that we have here. So if this was one whole excess space, the fourth one is getting 2/3 of it, and the second one is getting 1/3 of it. And if you just wanted to set the flex grow to 1, a factor of 1 for every single one of them, all you'd have to do is just select all of them by selecting this child, and we'll set the flex grow to a factor of 1, and that's going to evenly distribute all of the extra space to each one of these children. So this is 1 of 6, this is 2 of 6, and so on and so forth. These have got an even exact amount of space of the extra space that's in that flex container. Now the flex shrink property is nearly the same as the flex grow property, but it works in the opposite direction. So right here, I'm selecting this 6th child here, this really long one down here, and I'm setting the width to 800 pixels. Now, this is actually longer than this box, but it's not actually overflowing the box, and that's because we have a flex shrink set to a factor of 1 by default. So it's going to shrink it down to at least not be any bigger than the box by default. But if we set that to a 0, you're going to see that overflow the container, and it's going to run the width of the entire box that it's set at 800 pixels. So this is now a width of 800 pixels, and it is overflowing the box. But if we set our flex shrink to a factor of 1, it's just going to tell it not to overflow the box, basically. And that is everything you need to know for Flexbox. It gets very complicated there at the end, but it does get very easy once you understand it, you go through it, you play with it. Just play with it a lot, and it'll start to make sense, I guarantee it. But if you did have any questions, please leave them down in the comments down below. I'll answer all of your questions. If you did like the video, make sure you slap a like on it. Check out the full playlist, link is right next to me. Make sure you subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.